In the bustling city of Chicago, Mark was just another face in the crowd. He had been driving a taxi for over 20 years, navigating through traffic with practiced ease. To most people, he was invisible, a man behind the wheel who took them from one place to another without asking too many questions. But Mark saw more than most realized. Through his rearview mirror, he witnessed snippets of lives: hurried businessmen, tired mothers with crying children, tourists marveling at the skyline. Each passenger carried their own story, and Mark had learned to read between the lines. On a chilly November evening, as rain drizzled against the windshield, Mark cruised down Michigan Avenue. The streets were busy, filled with cars honking and pedestrians rushing to escape the cold. Just as he approached a red light, he noticed a man standing on the curb, waving weakly at passing taxis. Most drivers sped by, either too busy or unwilling to stop for someone who looked like they might not have much money. But something about this man caught Mark's attention. He pulled over, lowering the window slightly. "Need a ride?" he called out. The man hesitated, glancing around as if unsure whether to trust him. Finally, he nodded and climbed into the back seat. His clothes were worn, a faded jacket patched in places, boots scuffed and muddy. A small duffel bag rested at his feet, its fabric frayed from years of use. Mark glanced at him in the rearview mirror, noting the exhaustion etched into his face. "Where to?" Mark asked, keeping his tone light and friendly. The man hesitated again before answering. "There's a motel near the highway," he said softly. "Could you take me there?" His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper, but there was a quiet dignity in the way he spoke. Mark nodded and started the engine, pulling away from the curb. As they drove, the silence between them felt heavy. Most passengers would chat or listen to music during the ride, but this man just stared out the window, lost in thought. Mark couldn't help but notice how different he seemed from his usual fares. There was a sadness in his eyes, a weariness that went deeper than physical fatigue. It made Mark curious, though he knew better than to pry. Instead, he decided to break the ice casually. "Long day, huh?" Mark said, glancing at the man in the mirror. The man nodded slowly, his gaze still fixed on the passing streets. "Yeah," he replied after a moment. "You could say that." His words were simple, but there was a weight behind them, as if he carried burdens far heavier than anyone could see. Mark pressed gently, sensing that the man might need someone to talk to. "I've seen all kinds of people come and go in this city," he said, "but you don't strike me as someone from around here." The man turned his head slightly, meeting Mark's eyes in the mirror. For a brief moment, he looked surprised, as if no one had paid him much attention in a long time. "No," he admitted quietly. "I'm not from here. Just passing through." He didn't elaborate, returning his focus to the window. Mark let the silence settle, giving the man space to decide whether he wanted to share more. "A few blocks?" Later, the man spoke again, almost reluctantly. "My name's James," he said, his voice soft but steady. "And I guess you could say I've seen my fair share of places." Mark smiled warmly. "Nice to meet you, James. I'm Mark. Been driving this cab for over 20 years now. Never gets boring." James gave a faint smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Must be something," he muttered. Seeing the world from behind, the wheel. They continued talking, their conversation slow and measured. Mark learned that James was a veteran, though he didn't offer many details about his service. What he did say painted a picture of struggle, returning home to find himself adrift, unable to adjust to civilian life. "Things are different when you get back," James explained, his voice tinged with sadness. "People expect you to pick up where you left off, but it doesn't work like that. Some of us, we don't fit anymore." Mark listened intently, his heart going out to the man. He had heard stories like this before, soldiers returning home only to face unemployment, homelessness, or worse. It broke his heart every time. "That's rough," Mark said sincerely. "But hey, you're not alone. There are people who care, who want to help." James chuckled bitterly. "Not many, though. Not enough. By the time they reached the motel, the atmosphere in the car had shifted. What had started as a routine fare had turned into something deeper, a brief connection between two strangers brought together by chance. As James gathered his duffel bag and prepared to step out, Mark made a decision. "Wait," he said, reaching for the meter. "This one's on me." James froze, looking at Mark with a mix of surprise and disbelief. "What? No, I can't. It's fine." Mark interrupted, his tone firm but kind. "You've done enough for all of us. Consider it a thank you." James stared at him for a long moment, his jaw tightening as if fighting back emotions. Finally, he nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you. Really. That means more than you know." With that, he stepped out of the taxi and disappeared into the dimly lit motel lobby. Mark watched him go, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and unease. He had done what he thought was right, but there was something about James that lingered in his mind. The man's words echoed in his thoughts, about not fitting in, about carrying scars no one could see. Mark shook his head, trying to shake off the feeling. He was just a taxi driver doing his job, helping someone in need. What more could he do? Little did Mark know, this simple act of kindness would set off a chain of events neither of them could have predicted. Hours later, as he finished his shift and parked outside a diner, two men approached him. They introduced themselves as FBI agents and began asking questions about the man Mark had driven earlier that night. Startled, Mark realized he was now part of something far bigger and far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. The man climbed into the taxi, his movements slow and deliberate. He carried a small, worn-out duffel bag that looked like it had seen better days. His face was lined with exhaustion, and there was a heaviness in his eyes that spoke of years of hardship. Mark glanced at him through the rearview mirror as he started the engine. "Where to?" Mark asked, keeping his tone light and friendly. The man hesitated for a moment before replying, his voice hoarse but polite. "There's a motel on the outskirts of town. Could you take me there?" As they drove, the city lights blurred past the windows, casting fleeting reflections on the man's tired face. Mark couldn't help but notice how quiet his passenger was. Most people would chat or listen to music during a ride, but this man just stared out the window, lost in thought. Something about him felt different. There was an air of mystery, a story waiting to be told. After a few minutes of silence, Mark decided to break the ice. "Long day, huh?" he said casually, glancing back at the man through the mirror. The man nodded slightly, his gaze still fixed on the passing streets. "Yeah," he replied softly. "You could say that." His words were simple, but there was a weight behind them, as if he carried burdens far heavier than anyone could see. Mark pressed gently, sensing that the man might need someone to talk to. "I've been driving this route for years, seen all kinds of people come and go. You don't strike me as someone from around here." For the first time, the man turned his head to look directly at Mark. There was a flicker of curiosity in his eyes, as if he wasn't used to being noticed or cared about. "No," he admitted after a pause. "I'm not from here. Just passing through." His voice trailed off, and he returned his attention to the window. Mark didn't push further. Instead, he let the silence settle between them, giving the man space to decide whether he wanted to share more. A few blocks later, the man spoke again almost reluctantly. "I'm James," he said quietly, "and I guess you could say I've seen my fair share of places." Mark smiled warmly. "Nice to meet you, James. I'm Mark. Been driving this cab for over 20 years now. Never gets boring." James gave a faint smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Must be something," he muttered, seeing the world from behind the wheel. They continued talking, their conversation slow and measured. Mark learned that James was a veteran who had served overseas. He didn't offer many details, but it was clear that coming home hadn't been easy for him. "Things are different when you get back," James said, his voice tinged with sadness. People expect you to pick up where you left off, but it doesn't work like that. Some of us think we don't fit anymore. Mark listened intently, his heart going out to the man. He had heard stories like this before. Soldiers returning home to find themselves struggling to adjust, facing unemployment, homelessness, or worse. It broke his heart every time. That's rough, Mark said sincerely. But hey, you're not alone. There are people who care, who want to help. James chuckled bitterly. Not many, though. Not enough. By the time they reached the motel, the atmosphere in the car had shifted. What had started as a routine fare had turned into something deeper, a brief connection between two strangers brought together by chance. As James gathered his duffel bag and prepared to step out, Mark made a decision. "Wait," he said, reaching for the meter. "This one's on me." James froze, looking at Mark with a mixin of surprise and disbelief. "What? No, I can't. It's fine," Mark interrupted, his tone firm but kind. "You've done enough for all of us. Consider it a thank you." James stared at him for a long moment, his jaw tightening as if he were fighting back emotions. Finally, he nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you. Really, that means more than you know." With that, he stepped out of the taxi and disappeared into the dimly lit motel lobby. Mark watched him go, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and unease. He had done what he thought was right, but there was something about James that lingered in his mind. The man's words echoed in his thoughts, about not fitting in, about carrying scars no one could see. Mark shook his head, trying to shake off the feeling. He was just a taxi driver doing his job, helping someone in need. What more could he do? Later that night, as Mark finished up his shift and parked the taxi outside a diner, he didn't expect his evening to take another unexpected turn. Two men approached him, their presence commanding yet unassuming. They introduced themselves as FBI agents and began asking questions about the man Mark had driven earlier. At first, Mark felt confused. Why were they interested in James? But as they explained the situation, his confusion turned to alarm. James wasn't just any veteran, they told him. He was involved in a case involving stolen military documents. Someone had leaked classified information, and James was considered either a key witness or possibly even a suspect. Mark's mind raced as he processed this revelation. All he had wanted to do was help someone in need, but now he found himself entangled in something far bigger and far more dangerous than he could have imagined. The agents asked Mark to describe his encounter with James in detail. He recounted everything: the pickup location, their conversation, the motel where he dropped him off. As he spoke, he couldn't help but wonder if he had misjudged the situation entirely. Was James truly a hero trying to expose corruption, or was he part of something more sinister? The uncertainty gnawed at him, leaving him restless and uneasy. After the agents left, Mark sat in his taxi for a long time, staring out at the empty streets. He replayed the events of the night in his mind, searching for clues he might have missed. James had seemed genuine, grateful even for the free ride. But appearances could be deceiving, and Mark knew he had to consider the possibility that James wasn't who he claimed to be. Despite his growing doubts, Mark couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that there was more to the story. The way James spoke about his struggles, the sadness in his eyes, it all felt real. Could someone capable of such vulnerability really be guilty of betraying his country? Or was James simply a pawn in a much larger game, caught between forces beyond his control? These questions haunted Mark as he drove home, unsure of what the future held but certain that his life had changed forever because of one simple act of kindness. Hours later, Mark was sitting in his taxi outside a small diner on the edge of downtown Chicago. It was late, and the streets were quieter than usual. He had just finished his shift and was about to head home when two men approached him. They wore dark suits and carried badges clipped to their belts. One of them flashed an ID card quickly before introducing themselves as FBI agents. Mark's heart skipped a beat. His mind raced with questions. Why were they here? What did they want? From him? The taller of the two agents leaned against the hood of the taxi while the other stood nearby, hands in his pockets. "We're looking for someone," the taller agent began, his tone calm but firm. "A man who matches the description you gave earlier tonight." Mark hesitated for a moment, unsure how much he should say. Then he remembered the tired-looking veteran he had driven to the motel just hours ago. The memory of James's face came back to him, the way he stared out the window, lost in thought, as if carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. "Yes," Mark replied slowly, choosing his words carefully. "I picked up a guy who fit that description. He said he was a veteran. I dropped him off at a motel near the highway." The agents exchanged a glance, and Mark could tell this wasn't just a casual inquiry. Something serious was going on, and somehow he was caught in the middle of it. "Can you tell us anything else about him?" the shorter agent asked, pulling out a notepad. Mark described James in detail, the worn jacket, the scuffed boots, the quiet demeanor. He mentioned their brief conversation about James's struggles since returning home. As the agents listened intently, Mark couldn't help but feel uneasy. Why were they so interested in James? Was he in trouble? Or worse, was he dangerous? Finally, the taller agent spoke again. "That man you helped tonight, he's involved in something big. Classified military documents have gone missing, and we believe he has critical information about it." Mark's stomach churned. Stolen documents? Military secrets? None of this made sense. All he knew was that James seemed like a good person, someone who had sacrificed so much for his country only to be left struggling on the sidelines. The agents explained further, their voices low but urgent. James wasn't just any veteran. He had served in a highly sensitive role overseas. Now someone had leaked top-secret files, and James was either a key witness or potentially implicated in the crime. Either way, finding him was crucial. Mark felt torn. On one hand, he wanted to trust James, to believe that the man was innocent. But on the other hand, what if James really was involved in something illegal? What if Mark's act of kindness had unknowingly aided someone tied to national security threats? After answering all their questions, Mark watched as the agents walked away, leaving him alone with his thoughts. He sat in silence for a long time, replaying the events of the night in his mind. He remembered the gratitude in James's eyes when he told him the ride was free. He remembered the way James thanked him sincerely, calling him a rare, kind soul. Could someone capable of such warmth and humility really be guilty of betraying his country? Mark didn't know, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story than met the eye. The next morning, Mark woke up early, unable to sleep properly. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was another call from the FBI. They wanted him to come in for formal questioning. Though hesitant, Mark agreed. After showering and dressing, he drove to the federal building, where he was ushered into a plain room with a table and chairs. 2 different agents greeted him this time, both equally professional but less intimidating than the ones from the previous night. They assured him he wasn't in trouble, but they needed every detail he could provide about James. Mark recounted everything: the pickup location, the route they took, the motel where he dropped James off. He even shared bits of their conversation, though he kept some parts vague, unsure if they mattered. As he spoke, the agents scribbled notes furiously, occasionally nodding or asking follow-up questions. When they finally wrapped up, one of them slid a folder across the table. Inside were photos of James alongside documents detailing his military service record. Mark flipped through them, trying to reconcile the image of the man in the pictures with the person he had met just hours ago. Before leaving, the agents revealed new information that sent chills down Mark's spine. It turned out that James hadn't stayed at the motel. When authorities arrived to question him, he was already gone. The only thing left behind was his duffel bag, which contained nothing unusual except for a single USB drive disguised as a pen. Upon examination, the drive held encrypted files that appeared to contain classified data. This discovery only deepened the mystery surrounding James. Was he trying to hide evidence, or was he protecting himself from those who sought to silence him? Driving home, Mark wrestled with conflicting emotions. Part of him wanted to dismiss the entire situation as none of his business. After all, he was just a taxi driver doing his job. Yet another part of him couldn't ignore the nagging sense that he had played a role in something far bigger than himself. He tried to distract himself by focusing on mundane tasks, cleaning his cab, checking the oil, restocking snacks for passengers, but his mind kept drifting back to James. Over the next few days, Mark found himself obsessively following news, reports about the case. Details were scarce, but rumors swirled about a major scandal involving high-ranking officials and covert operations. Each article added another layer of intrigue, making it harder for Mark to stay detached. He couldn't stop thinking about James's weary expression, his soft-spoken gratitude, and the faint glimmer of hope in his eyes when Mark refused payment for the ride. Was James a victim of circumstance, caught between powerful forces beyond his control, or was he hiding something darker beneath the surface? One evening, as Mark scrolled through social media, he stumbled upon a post shared by a journalist known for exposing government corruption. The post included a blurry photo of a man resembling James standing near a courthouse, his face partially obscured by a hood. The caption hinted at a whistleblower attempting to reveal wrongdoing within the military. Mark stared at the screen, his pulse quickening. Could James really be the whistleblower everyone was talking about? If so, why hadn't he come forward sooner, and what risks was he facing now? By the end of the week, Mark realized he couldn't sit idly by any longer. Whether James was guilty or innocent, he deserved answers, and maybe, just maybe, Mark could help him get them. Resolved, Mark decided to take matters into his own hands. He started retracing his steps from the night he met James, visiting places he thought might hold clues. First, he returned to the motel hoping to learn more about James's disappearance. The manager recognized him immediately and confirmed that James had checked in briefly but vanished shortly afterward without paying. Next, Mark drove around neighborhoods where homeless veterans often gathered, asking discreetly if anyone had seen James. Most people shook their heads, but one older man claimed to have spotted someone matching James's description near a park. Encouraged, Mark spent hours driving back and forth along the park's perimeter, keeping an eye out for any sign of movement. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the empty paths, Mark began to lose hope. Maybe he was chasing ghosts, grasping at straws in a desperate attempt to make sense of things. But then, as he passed a dimly lit gas station adjacent to the park, he saw him. Sitting alone in a corner booth inside the attached diner, nursing a cup of coffee, was James. For a split second, Mark froze, unsure what to do. Should he call the FBI right away? Or should he confront James first, demand the truth? Taking a deep breath, Mark parked his taxi and stepped inside. James looked up as the door jingled, his eyes widening slightly when he recognized Mark. There was no mistaking the mix of surprise and fear in his expression. Mark slid into the booth across from him, his heart pounding. "You've got some explaining to do," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside him. James hesitated, glancing toward the door as if considering escape. But then, seeing the sincerity in Mark's gaze, he sighed deeply and nodded. "I know," he murmured, "and I'm sorry for dragging you into this." Mark sat across from James in the dimly lit diner, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead filling the silence between them. The air felt heavy, charged with unspoken tension. James's hands trembled slightly as he gripped his coffee mug, his eyes darting toward the door every few seconds. Mark could see the fear etched into his face, but there was something else too. Resignation, maybe even relief that someone had finally found him. "Start talking," Mark said firmly, leaning forward. "What's going on? Why are the FBI looking for you?" James took a deep breath, his shoulders sagging as if the weight of everything he'd been carrying was finally too much to bear. "It's complicated," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I thought I was doing the right thing." He paused, staring down at the table as if searching for the right words. Mark waited patiently, sensing that James needed time to gather his thoughts. "I was stationed overseas," James continued after a moment, "in a place where things weren't always black and white. Orders came down, and sometimes those orders, they didn't sit right with me. But I followed them because that's what soldiers do. His voice cracked, and he cleared his throat before continuing. When I got back, I couldn't stop thinking about some of the things I saw, things that shouldn't have happened, people who got hurt, not just soldiers, but civilians too. Mark listened intently, his brow furrowed. What kind of things? He asked gently, not wanting to push too hard but needing to understand. James hesitated again, glancing around the nearly empty diner as if worried someone might overhear. Corruption, he said finally. People in high places making decisions that cost lives, money changing hands, secrets being kept. I tried to report it through the proper channels, but nothing happened. No one cared, or if they did, they were too scared to act. His fingers tightened around the mug, knuckles turning white. So I started digging deeper. I copied files, evidence of what I'd seen. I thought if I could get it to the right people, maybe someone would listen. Maybe they'd do something about it. He looked up at Mark, his eyes pleading for understanding. But then, things got worse. Someone found out what I was doing. They started following me, threatening me. That's why I left. I didn't know who to trust anymore. Mark sat back in his seat, processing everything James had said. It sounded like something out of a movie, a lone soldier trying to expose corruption while running from powerful enemies. But this wasn't fiction. It was real life, and somehow Mark was sitting right in the middle of it. The USB drive, Mark said slowly. That's what the FBI is after, isn't it? Those files you mentioned. James nodded, his expression grim. Yeah, it's all on there. Everything I've gathered over the years. If it gets into the wrong hands, he trailed off, shaking his head. Let's just say a lot of people would do whatever it takes to make sure those files stay hidden. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of the situation hung between them, thick and suffocating. Mark stared at James, trying to reconcile the man sitting across from him with the image the FBI had painted, a suspect in a national security breach. He wanted to believe James, to trust that he was telling the truth. But how could he be sure? What if James was lying? What if he really was guilty? Finally, Mark broke the silence. Why didn't you go to the authorities when you first realized? What was happening, he asked. Or tell someone you trusted. James let out a bitter laugh. Who could I trust? My commanding officers. Half of them were involved. My family? They don't even know half the stuff I've been through. And as for the authorities, he shrugged helplessly. Look where I am now, running for my life because I tried to do the right thing. Mark sighed, rubbing his temples. This whole situation was spiraling out of control, and he wasn't even directly involved. Yet here he was, sitting across from a man who might hold the key to exposing a massive conspiracy, or who might be in the middle of something far more dangerous than either of them realized. What are you going to do now? Mark asked quietly. You can't keep running forever. James looked down at his hands, fidgeting with the edge of the napkin beside his coffee cup. I don't know, he admitted. Every move I make feels like I'm walking into a trap. I don't know who's on my side anymore or if anyone is. He glanced up at Mark, his eyes filled with desperation. I need help. Not just to hide, but to figure out what to do next. To get these files to someone who can actually make a difference. Mark hesitated, torn between caution and compassion. Helping James meant putting himself at risk, stepping further into a world he didn't fully understand. But leaving him alone felt wrong, like abandoning someone drowning in a stormy sea. Okay, Mark said finally, surprising even himself. I'll help you, but we have to be smart about it. We can't just walk into this blindly. Relief washed over James's face, though it was tinged with disbelief. Why are you doing this? He asked. After everything I've told you, why would you stick your neck out for me? Mark shrugged, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Because somebody has to. Because you're not the bad guy here, or at least, I don't think you are. And because sometimes doing the right thing means taking risks. They spent the next hour hashing out a plan. Mark suggested reaching out to investigative journalists known for uncovering government scandals. "If anyone can protect you and get the truth out, it's them," he explained. James agreed reluctantly, though he still seemed skeptical that anyone could truly shield him from the forces hunting him. Together they decided to retrieve the USB drive from the motel room where James had left it behind. From there they would contact a journalist and hand over the files. As they left the diner, the cool night air hit them like a slap. Mark glanced around nervously, half expecting shadowy figures to emerge from the darkness. "We should hurry," he said, ushering James toward the taxi. "The longer we wait, the more dangerous this gets." James nodded, clutching his duffel bag tightly as they climbed into the car. As Mark started the engine, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every passing car, every flicker of movement in the rearview mirror made his skin crawl. The drive to the motel was tense, both men silent as they scanned their surroundings for signs of trouble. When they arrived, Mark parked a block away, just in case someone was already staking out the area. "Stay close," he whispered as they approached the building. The lobby was deserted, the manager nowhere to be seen. They slipped upstairs to the room James had stayed in earlier, finding it exactly as he'd left it. The USB drive was still tucked inside the fake pen, hidden beneath the mattress. Back in the taxi, James clutched the drive tightly, his knuckles white. "Now what?" he asked, his voice shaky. "We find a safe place to regroup," Mark replied. "Then we reach out to the journalist, one step at a time." As they drove off into the night, Mark couldn't help but wonder if they were heading toward salvation, or straight into the lion's den. The night was cold and quiet as Mark and James drove away from the motel, the USB drive safely tucked inside James's duffel bag. Neither of them spoke much, each lost in their own thoughts. Mark gripped the steering wheel tightly, his eyes constantly scanning the rearview mirror for any signs of trouble. Every car that passed felt like a potential threat. Every shadow on the street seemed to move with purpose. He knew they were playing a dangerous game, one where the stakes were higher than either of them fully understood. James sat in the passenger seat, clutching the bag close to his chest. His face was pale, his jaw clenched as if bracing himself for the worst. "Do you think they're already looking for us?" he asked finally, breaking the silence. Mark glanced at him briefly before focusing back on the road. "Probably," he admitted, "but we've got a head start. As long as we stay smart, we should be okay." The words sounded reassuring, but even Mark wasn't sure he believed them. This wasn't a movie or a book. It was real life, and real life didn't always have happy endings. After driving for nearly an hour, Mark pulled into the parking lot of a small, out-of-the-way motel on the edge of town. It wasn't fancy, but it would do for now. They needed somewhere safe to regroup, somewhere no one would think to look for them. "We'll stay here tonight," Mark said, turning off the engine. "In the morning, we'll figure out our next move." James nodded, though his expression remained tense. He followed Mark inside, keeping his head down as they checked in under fake names. Once they were settled in their room, Mark locked the door and drew the curtains shut. The room was small and smelled faintly of stale cigarettes, but it felt like a fortress compared to the uncertainty outside. James placed the duffel bag on the bed and opened it carefully, pulling out the USB drive. He held it up, staring at it as if it were both a lifeline and a curse. "This is it," he murmured. "Everything I've been running for. Everything they want." Mark sat down across from him, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. "About handing these files over to a journalist? Once we do that, there's no going back." James hesitated, his fingers tracing the edges of the drive. "I don't see another way," he said quietly. "If I try to fight this alone, I'll lose. If I destroy the files, nothing changes. This might be my only chance to make things right." Mark nodded slowly, understanding the weight of what James was saying. "All right," he said after a moment. "Then we need to find someone trustworthy. Someone who can handle this kind of story without getting themselves or us killed." He pulled out his phone and began searching online for investigative journalists known for exposing government corruption. After scrolling through several profiles, he found one name that stood out: Sarah Collins, a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter famous for her work uncovering scandals involving powerful organizations. She's based in Chicago, Mark said, showing James the article he'd found. If anyone can help, it's her. James studied the photo of Sarah, a woman in her late 30s with sharp eyes and a determined expression, and nodded. She looks tough, he said. That's good. We'll need someone who won't back down. Mark agreed, then sent her a brief message through a secure contact form on her website. I didn't give too many details, he explained. Just enough to get her attention. She'll probably want to meet in person. The hours dragged by as they waited for a response. To pass the time, Mark ordered takeout from a nearby diner while James paced nervously around the room. Neither of them dared turn on the TV or open the curtains, afraid of drawing attention to themselves. When Mark's phone finally buzzed with a reply, they both froze. Well? James asked, his voice tight with anticipation. Mark read the message aloud. She says she's interested but wants proof before committing. She also suggested meeting tomorrow at a public library downtown. It's crowded, so it should be safe. James exhaled sharply, relief washing over his face. Okay, he said. That works. Let's hope she's on our side. Mark nodded, though he couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into unknown territory. Public places weren't always as safe as they seemed, especially when dealing with people who had everything to lose. The next morning, they left the motel early, taking a roundabout route to avoid being followed. By the time they reached the library, the streets were alive with commuters rushing to work. Mark parked a few blocks away and they walked the rest of the distance, blending into the crowd. Inside the library, they found Sarah waiting for them, near the reference section, her laptop open on the table in front of her. She looked up as they approached, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied them. You must be Mark, she said, standing to shake his hand. Her voice was calm, but firm, commanding respect without raising suspicion. And this is... Mark gestured toward James. This is James. He's the one with the story. Sarah nodded, motioning for them to sit. All right, she said, folding her arms across her chest. Let's hear it. James took a deep breath and began explaining everything. The stolen military documents, the corruption he'd uncovered, the threats against his life. Sarah listened intently, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she leaned back in her chair, tapping her pen against the table. You realize how big this is, don't you? She asked. If even half of what you're saying is true, it could blow wide open. That's why we came to you, Mark interjected. We need someone who can protect the information and James, while getting the truth out. Sarah nodded thoughtfully, then glanced at James. Do you trust me with the files? She asked. James hesitated, glancing at Mark for reassurance. Finally, he handed her the USB drive. It's all there, he said. Every last detail. Sarah plugged the drive into her laptop and began reviewing its contents, her eyes widening as she scrolled through the encrypted files. This is huge, she muttered almost to herself. If we play this right, it could change everything. She looked up at them, her expression serious. But you need to understand something. Once I publish this, there's no turning back. You'll both be targets. Are you ready for that? Mark and James exchanged a glance, their unspoken agreement clear. We don't have a choice, James said firmly. This isn't just about me anymore. It's about doing the right thing. Sarah nodded, closing her laptop. All right, she said. Here's what we're going to do. As she laid out her plan, Mark felt a mix of fear and determination settle in his chest. They were stepping into uncharted waters, risking everything for a chance to expose the truth. But as he glanced at James, he knew it was worth it. Some fights were too important to walk away from. Sarah's plan was simple but risky. She would publish the story in stages, starting with a teaser article that hinted at the corruption without revealing too much. This would give her time to gather more evidence while keeping James and Mark safe. We need to protect our sources, she explained, her tone calm but urgent. If we move too fast, They'll come after us before we're ready. Mark nodded, understanding the importance of caution. James, however, looked uneasy, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "What if they find me before you can finish?" James asked, his voice trembling slightly. Sarah leaned forward, her eyes steady and reassuring. "That's why I'm going, to help you disappear for a while," she said. "I have contacts who specialize in keeping people off the grid. You'll be safe until the full story breaks." James hesitated, glancing at Mark for support. Mark gave him a small nod, silently telling him to trust her. Finally, James sighed and agreed. "All right," he said. "Let's do it." Over the next few days, Sarah worked tirelessly, verifying the information on the USB drive and reaching out to other whistleblowers who could corroborate James's claims. Meanwhile, Mark helped James pack up what little he owned and prepared him for life on the run. It wasn't easy. James had already lost so much, and now he was being asked to leave behind even more. But he didn't argue. He knew there was no other way. The day before James was set to go into hiding, Mark drove him to a remote cabin outside the city where Sarah's contacts were waiting. The journey was tense, both men constantly checking their surroundings for signs of trouble. When they arrived, two men greeted them at the door, their faces unreadable. "You must be James," one of them said, stepping aside to let him in. James turned to Mark, his expression filled with gratitude and sadness. "Thank you," he said softly, "for everything." Mark forced a smile, though his heart ached. "Take care of yourself," he replied. "And don't give up. The truth is worth fighting for." With that, James disappeared inside, leaving Mark standing alone in the cold. As he drove away, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of loss. He had grown to admire James's courage, and saying goodbye felt like closing a chapter he wasn't ready to end. Back in Chicago, Sarah published the first article. It caused an immediate stir, sparking debates across social media and news outlets. People were outraged, demanding answers from the government and military officials implicated in the scandal. But as expected, powerful forces pushed back, accusing Sarah of fabricating the story and threatening legal action. Through it all, Sarah remained steadfast, releasing new details bit by bit to keep the pressure on. A week later, the full story broke. The files on the USB drive painted a damning picture of corruption, greed, and betrayal at the highest levels of power. Names were named, crimes were exposed, and the public outcry reached a fever pitch. Investigations were launched, arrests were made, and reforms began to take shape. It was messy and chaotic, but the truth was finally coming to light. For Mark, watching the fallout from afar was surreal. His simple act of kindness had snowballed into something far greater than he ever imagined. He returned to his routine, driving his taxi through the streets of Chicago, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had been part of something extraordinary. Strangers began recognizing him when they saw him on the news talking about how he'd met James. Some called him a hero, others dismissed him as naive. But none of that mattered to Mark. What mattered was knowing he had done the right thing. As weeks turned into months, life slowly returned to normal, or as close to normal as it could be after such an event. Sarah continued her work, uncovering more scandals and holding those in power accountable. James remained in hiding, occasionally sending updates to Mark through Sarah. He was safe, rebuilding his life piece by piece, grateful for the second chance he'd been given. One evening, as Mark sat in his taxi parked near the lakefront, he reflected on everything that had happened. He thought about James, the man who had carried the weight of the world on his shoulders, and Sarah, the journalist brave enough to stand up to giants. And he thought about himself, just a taxi driver who had chosen to help someone in need. In the end, it wasn't about fame or glory. It was about doing what was right even when it was hard. Mark smiled faintly, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The city lights twinkled around him, a reminder of the countless lives intertwined in ways big and small. Somewhere out there, James was starting over, free from the shadows that had haunted him for so long. And Mark? He was exactly where he belonged, behind the wheel, ready to pick up the next passenger, whoever they might be.